"Marry me," the stranger said, dropping a single gold coin on the counter between them. Not a ring, not a flower, just cold metal catching the light, while the whole mercantile store went silent around them. Elizabeth Carter stared at that coin, then at the man's worn boots, his cracked leather jacket, the dust still settling off his shoulders from the road. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from. All she knew was that her brother had 3 days before they threw him out of the doctor's care, and this stranger was looking at her like he already knew her answer. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The coin was still spinning on the counter when Elizabeth finally found her voice. "I don't know you." The man didn't flinch. He just stood there with his hands loose at his sides, his hat tilted low enough to keep half his face in shadow, watching that gold coin like he had all the time in the world. "No," he agreed. "You don't." "Then why would you?" "Because I need a wife." He said it plainly, not with arrogance, not with apology. The way a man states a fact, he has already turned over 100 times before deciding to speak it out loud. "And I think you need something too." Elizabeth looked around the mercantile. Old Mr. Hennessy had stopped pretending to stock his shelves. The 2 women near the window, Martha Pruitt and her daughter, had gone completely still. Even the young stock boy in the back had poked his head around the corner to stare. The whole town of Willow Creek was watching, and Elizabeth Carter had spent enough years in Willow Creek to know that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds would be the only thing anyone talked about for the rest of the winter. She picked up the coin. It was heavier than she expected. Real gold, not a token, not a trinket. The kind of coin most people in Willow Creek never held more than once in their lives. "One coin doesn't buy a wife," she said. "No," the man said. "It doesn't. But it tells you I'm serious." He reached up and tilted his hat back just slightly enough for her to see his eyes. Dark brown, steady. Not the eyes of a desperate man. Not the eyes of a fool. "My name is Caleb Whitmore. I have a place outside of town north toward the mountains. I can give you a home, food, security, whatever your family needs." "My family." She said it carefully. "Your brother, Thomas." He said the name quietly like he was handling something fragile. "He's been at Doc Harlan's for 2 weeks. The bill is past due." Elizabeth's grip tightened on the coin. "How do you know that ye—" "Small town," Caleb said simply. "People talk." She stared at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. He didn't shift or fidget or try to fill the silence with more words. He just waited, and that patience, that absolute stillness, was somehow the most unsettling thing about him. "You're a cowboy," she finally said. "You look like you barely have enough for your own supper." Something moved behind his eyes. Not offense, not embarrassment. Something quieter than either of those things. He glanced down at his jacket, the worn elbows, the faded collar, the boots that had been resoled at least twice, and then back up at her. "I have enough," he said. "More than enough." Martha Pruitt couldn't contain herself any longer. "Elizabeth," she said from across the store, not even pretending she hadn't been listening. "Surely you're not actually considering—" "Martha." Elizabeth didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn around. "I don't recall asking." Martha's mouth closed. Elizabeth looked back at Caleb Whitmore. "Give me until tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded once, put his hat back down, and walked out of the mercantile without another word. The door swung shut behind him. And then, every person in that store started talking at once. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small table in the 2-room house she rented on the east side of town, the gold coin in front of her, her needle and thread untouched beside it. Through the thin wall, she could hear Thomas coughing the same deep rattling cough that had started in September and hadn't stopped since. She was 26 years old. She had been the head of this household since she was 19, since the fever took their mother in the spring, and their father rode out that same summer and never came back. 7 years of sewing until her fingers bled of smiling at women who looked through her at church of stretching $3 until it felt like 10. She had survived. She had kept Thomas alive. She had done every single thing a person was supposed to do. And it still wasn't enough. Doc Harlan had been kinder than he needed to be. But he was a businessman too, and 2 weeks of medicine and bed care and careful watching cost real money. He had told her on Monday that he couldn't carry the debt past the end of the week. She had 4 days. She turned the coin over in her hand. On one side, the standard stamping. On the other, nothing unusual, just worn smooth from handling, as if someone had carried it for a long time before placing it on that counter. I have enough. More than enough. She thought about his eyes. The way he hadn't looked at her like a charity case, hadn't looked at her the way most men in this town did, either like a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be used. He had looked at her like she was a person, like he was simply presenting terms and waiting to see if she agreed. That more than anything kept her awake. At 4 a.m, Thomas called out from the other room. Not in distress, just restless, half awake, the way he got when the nights were long. Lizzie. She went to him, sat on the edge of his bed. He was 16 years old, and looked 12. Fever had whittled him down over the past weeks. And lying in that bed, he looked so much like the small boy she used to read to by candlelight that something ached in her chest. "You okay?" she asked. "Can't sleep." He looked up at her. Even sick, his eyes were sharp. He had always been sharp, Thomas. Too sharp for his own comfort sometimes. "What are you doing up?" "Thinking." "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A man came into the store today, asked me to marry him." Thomas was very still for a moment. Then, "What kind of man?" "A cowboy. At least that's what he looks like." She turned the coin over once more. "He gave me this." Thomas looked at it. His eyes widened just slightly. "That's a $20 gold piece." "I know." "Lizzie, I know Thomas." He looked at her in the way he had that always made her feel like he was older than her instead of 10 years younger. "What are you going to do?" Elizabeth closed her fingers around the coin. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm going to say yes." The next morning she found Caleb Whitmore at the edge of town, exactly where the north road began to climb toward the mountains. He was sitting on a fence post, eating an apple, his horse tied nearby, a big gray animal, unremarkable looking, but Elizabeth noticed the quality of its hooves, the muscle in its hindquarters. Whatever else Caleb Whitmore was, he knew horses. He saw her coming and stood up without hurrying. "Well," he said. "I have conditions," Elizabeth said. He looked at her with what might have been the beginning of respect. "All right. My brother comes with me. Whatever arrangement you're offering, it covers him too. His medicine, his care, everything until he's well." Agreed. She had expected negotiation. His quick agreement threw her off just enough that she hesitated before continuing. "I want to know where we're going. I want to know what your home actually looks like before I commit to anything permanent. That I can't show you in advance," he said. "But I give you my word you won't be disappointed." "Your word," she repeated. "I don't know you well enough to know what your word is worth." "No," he said. "You don't, not yet." He met her gaze. "But you'll find out." She studied him for a long moment. The worn jacket, the simple hat, the boots with the cracked left toe. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or comfort or anything beyond a hard season of working land that gave back less than it took. But there was something in the way he held himself that she couldn't quite name. A gravity, a kind of quiet sureness that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a man who simply knew exactly where he stood. "One more condition," she said. "Go ahead. This is a partnership, not a transaction. I'm not agreeing to be furniture in someone's house. If I come with you, I work, I contribute, I have a voice." For the first time since she'd met him, Caleb Whitmore smiled. It was small and brief and changed his face entirely. "Agreed," he said. "All three." She put out her hand. He shook it firm, direct, the handshake of someone who meant it. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "Gives you time to settle things here." She nodded and turned to go. "Miss Carter?" She looked back. "Thank you," he said. And he meant that too, she could hear it. She didn't answer. She walked back toward town with the gold coin still in her pocket, and the strange, unsettling feeling that she had just made either the smartest or the most foolish decision of her life, and that she genuinely could not tell which. The town made sure she knew their opinion. By that afternoon, word had traveled from one end of Willow Creek to the other. Elizabeth Carter was marrying Caleb Whitmore, the quiet drifter. Nobody knew the cowboy who'd been passing through for 3 weeks. The man who looked like he owned nothing but the shirt on his back. She heard it at the seamstress shop where she still owed for her last bolt of thread. She heard it at the well. She heard it through the thin walls of her rented house when Mrs. Garfield next door had her sister over for supper and didn't bother to lower her voice. That poor girl. Desperate is what she is. Can you blame her brother? Sick, no family, no prospects. But a cowboy with no land, no money, no name. She's throwing herself away is what she's doing. Well, let her learn the hard way. Some women have to. Elizabeth sat at her sewing table and kept her hands moving. Thread in needle through, thread out. The rhythm of it had kept her steady for 7 years. It kept her steady now. What she didn't do was cry. She had cried when her mother died. She had cried when her father left. She had cried alone privately in the dark where no one could see. And then she had gotten up and gone back to work. She was done letting Willow Creek see her break. Martha Pruitt came to the shop the next morning, came personally, which meant she considered this a serious enough social emergency to leave her house before 10. Elizabeth. She sat down across the work table without being invited. I'm going to speak frankly. When have you ever done otherwise? Martha's mouth tightened. I know you're in a difficult position, with Thomas with the money. But this man, nobody knows him. He rode in from nowhere. He has nothing. You are going to spend your life working yourself to the bone for a man who can't even afford new boots. Elizabeth kept sewing. He had a $20 gold piece, she said. One coin doesn't make a man reliable. No, Elizabeth agreed. It doesn't. Then why? Because he looked me in the eye. She set down her needle, looked at Martha directly. In 7 years, Martha, 7 years of me keeping this shop open, keeping Thomas alive, doing everything right. How many men in this town have looked me in the eye and spoken to me like I was a full person and not a problem to feel sorry for? Martha didn't answer. He did, Elizabeth said. First conversation, 15 minutes. She picked her needle back up. Maybe that doesn't mean anything. Maybe I'll get up there and find out he's a fool and I've made a terrible mistake, but I've made decisions with worse odds than that. Martha stood, straightened her coat. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, Elizabeth said quietly. The morning they left, 3 people came to see them off. Doc Harlan, who shook Elizabeth's hand and told her Thomas's last 2 days of care were already paid. He showed her the receipt, a clean $20, settled the previous afternoon. She looked at Caleb. He said nothing, just checked the saddle straps on his horse. Old Mr. Hennessy, from the mercantile, who pressed a small paper package into her hands, thread needles, a small pair of scissors, and told her she was the best customer he'd ever had, and he hoped she found good land and good people wherever she was going. And Thomas himself, bundled in his coat, still pale, but standing on his own 2 feet, for the first time in 2 weeks, who looked at Caleb Whitmore for a long moment with that too sharp gaze of his. You'll take care of her, Thomas said. Caleb looked at him with what seemed like genuine surprise, as if the question had come from an unexpected direction. We'll take care of each other, Caleb said. Thomas seemed to consider this. Then he gave a short nod as if he'd made a private judgment and it had come out in favor. Elizabeth helped her brother into the wagon. Caleb took the reins, and they rolled north out of Willow Creek, while the town watched from behind curtains and doorframes, shaking their collective head at the poor, foolish woman who had married a stranger with worn-out boots. Nobody waved goodbye. Caleb didn't look back. Neither did Elizabeth. Neat. The first day of travel was quiet. Thomas slept in the wagon bed, exhausted from the effort of simply getting up and moving. Elizabeth sat beside Caleb on the front bench, watching the country change as they moved away from town, the flat main street giving way to rolling pasture, the pasture giving way to heavier timber, the road narrowing and the mountains growing larger ahead of them. She had not been outside of Willow Creek in 4 years. She had forgotten how large the world was. After an hour of silence, she said, "Where did you grow up?" "Here," Caleb said. "Montana, different part of it." "Do you have family?" A brief pause. "Not anymore." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He said it without bitterness, without the hard edge that usually accompanied that particular answer. Just a statement of fact. It was a long time ago. She tried another direction. "What did you do before you came to Willow Creek?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Worked the land. Managed things." "Managed what things?" He glanced at her sideways. The ghost of that small smile again. "You're curious." "You asked me to marry you after 15 minutes of conversation," she said. "I think curiosity is appropriate." He actually laughed at that, a short, genuine sound. "Fair point." He looked back at the road. "I managed a ranch." "Your ranch?" The pause was just a little too long. "A ranch," he said. She filed that away. "And you gave it up to come work as a cowboy in Willow Creek." "Something like that." "That doesn't make very much sense." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it doesn't." He didn't offer more. She didn't push, not yet. The mountains were getting closer, and the road was getting narrower, and there was something about the way he sat with that particular question, not defensive, but simply still, that told her the answer existed and would come when it was ready. What she noticed instead was how he handled the horses. Firmly, confidently, with a touch that was sure without being harsh. How he read the road ahead, noting a soft patch in the ground before they reached it, steering around it without comment. How his eyes moved constantly, cataloging the landscape around them, with the practiced attention of a man who had spent years learning to read land. He wasn't performing competence, he simply had it. That evening they made camp at the edge of a creek. Caleb had known it was there without checking, had said simply, "We'll stop in another mile." And a mile later, there was the creek exactly as if he'd read the map of this country from memory. Thomas was awake by then. Groggy but functional, and he sat by the fire. Caleb built and ate the food Caleb had packed. Real food, not trail hardtack, actual bread, and dried beef, and a wedge of good cheese, and watched Caleb with those sharp 16-year-old eyes. "You know this country," Thomas said. Caleb stirred the fire. "Well enough." "You've been through here before." "A few times." Thomas chewed on his bread. Then, "The food is good. Better than I expected." "That's a low bar," Caleb said. Thomas grinned, the first real grin Elizabeth had seen from him in weeks. "You're all right," he pronounced in the tone of someone delivering a verdict they consider important. Caleb looked at him with an expression that was almost warm. "Get some sleep. Still 2 days to go." That night, after Thomas had rolled back into his blankets in the wagon and the fire had burned down to coals, Elizabeth sat in the quiet and listened to the creek and tried to organize her thoughts into something she could work with. She was 3 hours north of Willow Creek, heading deeper into mountains she'd never been inside of, riding toward a home she'd never seen beside a man she'd known for 2 days. She had either saved her brother's life or destroyed her own. She looked across the dying fire at Caleb, who had his back to a tree and his hat over his face. Asleep or close to it. She thought about what Thomas had said. "You're all right." Thomas had good instincts, always had. She held on to that and closed her eyes. On the second day, everything started to feel different. The road, she could barely call it a road anymore. It had narrowed to a trail, and the trail was edged on both sides by timber so dense and old it felt like traveling through a cathedral. The light came through at angles gold-green and shifting. Twice they crossed wooden bridges over fast streams, and both bridges were solidly built, well-maintained, far too good for a wilderness track that supposedly led nowhere. Elizabeth noted the bridges. She noted the fence line she could see occasionally through the trees, long, straight, professionally set posts with good wire. Someone had built that fence with real resources and real intention. She noted the way Caleb's shoulders changed slightly, the deeper they went. Not tension, the opposite of tension. Like a man who had been holding himself carefully in company and was now gradually allowing himself to settle. She noticed all of this and said nothing. On the afternoon of the second day, they stopped at the crest of a long ridge. Caleb sat back in the reins and turned to look at her. "Before we go over," he said. Something in his voice stopped her. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between apprehension and resolve, like a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is finally deciding whether to set it down. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need to tell you something, before we get there." Her heart moved in a strange way. Not fear exactly. Alertness. "All right. I wasn't entirely honest with you in Willow Creek." "About what?" He looked straight at her. "About what I have." The silence that followed was very specific. Not empty, full of the sound of wind in the pines and the horses shifting their weight and Thomas turning over in the wagon bed behind them. "Caleb," she kept her voice level, "what exactly are we about to see on the other side of this ridge?" He held her gaze. "My home," he said. "What it actually looks like." And he clicked the horses forward before she could say another word. She heard it before she saw it. Not the estate itself, something else. The sound of cattle, low and widespread, the particular deep murmur of a large herd that had settled in for the evening. The sound of it came up from below, rich and heavy, and with it the smell, hay and earth and working animals and something wood smoke sweet beneath it all. Then they cleared the tree line at the edge of the ridge, and Elizabeth Carter stopped breathing. Below them, filling the hidden valley between the mountains like something out of a story, lay the Whitmore estate. She had expected at best a comfortable homestead, a proper cabin perhaps, a barn in decent repair, maybe 30 or 40 head of cattle if he'd been lucky in his season. What she saw was something else entirely. The valley floor was green, impossibly green for this late in the year, which meant irrigation, which meant engineering, which meant resources she couldn't begin to calculate. The fencing below was not the rough wire she'd glimpsed through the trees. It was proper ranch fencing, miles of it perfectly maintained. The barns there were 3 of them, enormous, their roofs solid, their sides straight. Beyond the barns were smaller outbuildings, a bunkhouse, what looked like a smithy, structures she couldn't name from this distance. And there, at the center of it all, set back from the working buildings, on a small natural rise, the house. It was not a cabin. It was not even a large farmhouse. It was a mansion, 2 full stories of cut stone and good timber with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and windows that caught the evening light and threw it back like it had something to prove. It was the kind of house that took years to build and the kind of money that most people in Montana Territory would never see. Elizabeth turned very slowly to look at Caleb Whitmore. He was watching her face with an expression she had never seen on him before. Careful, vulnerable, waiting. "Who are you?" she said. His jaw moved. "The same man you agreed to marry. That is not a poor cowboy's home." "No," he said quietly. "It's not." "Caleb." Her voice was absolutely steady, even though nothing inside her was steady at all. "I want the truth. Right now, before we go 1 foot further." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the brake on the wagon, climbed down, and came around to her side. He stood below her, looking up, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that was not composure or patience or that careful stillness. Something that looked underneath all of it, like a man who was genuinely, deeply afraid. "My name is Caleb Whitmore," he said. "My family has owned this valley for 30 years. My father built that house. When he died 5 years ago, it passed to me." He paused. "All of it. The land, the cattle, the buildings. Everything you're looking at." The wind moved in the pines behind them. "Then, why?" Elizabeth said with great precision. "Were you in Willow Creek wearing a coat with holes in the elbows, asking a seamstress to marry you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I've been looking for someone for 3 years. Someone who would see me just me without all of this in the way. And every time I told the truth, all anyone could see was the estate." He held her gaze. "I needed to know," he said, "if you would still choose me when there was nothing to gain." Elizabeth looked at him for a very long time. Then she looked down at the valley, at the mansion, at the barns, at the miles of fencing, at the herd that moved below like a slow, dark river. Then she looked back at him. "You lied to me," she said. "I never said a false word." "You let me assume." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "I did." "That is still a lie, Caleb. A lie by omission is still a lie." He took that, didn't argue it, just held the weight of it the way a man does when he knows he has earned the thing being placed on him. "Yes," he said, "you're right." Behind them, Thomas had gone completely silent in the wagon. Elizabeth looked at the valley one more time. Everything she had left behind came back to her in a rush. The thin walls of the rented house, the seamstress shop, the 7 years of just enough, the face Thomas made when he thought she couldn't see him worrying about money. And then she thought about what she had agreed to, the conditions she had set, a partnership, not a transaction. I have a voice. He had agreed to all of it. He had paid Thomas's bill. He had packed good food for the road. He had said we'll take care of each other to her sick 16-year-old brother without hesitating. None of that changed because of what lay at the bottom of this ridge. But something else had changed, something that mattered. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it. "Take us down," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I didn't say I forgave you," she said. "I said take us down. I want to see what else you haven't told me." He looked at her for a moment, with something that was very clearly relief, not triumph, not satisfaction, but the particular relief of a man who has been bracing for the worst and been given instead something more complicated. He climbed back up, took the reins. "There's not much else," he said. "I'll decide that," Elizabeth said. And as the wagon rolled forward over the ridge and began the long descent into the hidden valley, with the evening light falling golden across the mansion and the barns and the green impossible pastures below, Elizabeth Carter sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing and felt the whole shape of her life shifting beneath her like ground that had just revealed it was not as solid as she thought. She was not afraid, but she was paying attention. And somewhere behind her, Thomas Carter, 16 years old and nobody's fool, looked out over the valley with wide eyes and then looked at the back of Caleb Whitmore's head and smiled a quiet private smile that his sister didn't see. Because Thomas had known from the moment of the handshake on that first morning from the quality of the food and the bridges in the forest and the way a man who claimed to have nothing sat a horse like he owned every acre beneath its feet. He had known something was different about this cowboy. He just hadn't known how different. Now he did, and he decided privately that he approved. End of Part 1. The first person to meet them at the bottom of the ridge was a man named Samuel Cole. He was somewhere past 60, with a white beard cropped close, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood as the fence posts he spent his days fixing. He came out from the main barn at a fast walk when he heard the wagon, and when he saw Caleb on the bench, his whole face changed. Not surprise exactly, but something warmer than relief. Something that looked like a man who had been waiting for something he wasn't sure would come back. "Boss." He said it simply. Elizabeth heard that word and went very still. Caleb climbed down from the wagon. "Sam, how's everything?" "Running smooth. Heard you were due back sometime this week." Samuel's eyes moved to Elizabeth, quick, respectful, but thorough. The look of a man who had spent decades reading people. "This her?" "This is Elizabeth," Caleb said. "My wife." Samuel removed his hat immediately. "Ma'am." He said it with real courtesy, the kind that isn't performed but simply is. "Welcome to Whitmore." Elizabeth looked at Samuel, then at the men who had stopped working behind him. 5 of them visible more she could sense further back, all of them looking at Caleb and then at her with the particular attention of people who had been waiting to see what their employer brought home. "Thank you," she said. And meant it, though. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Thomas appeared at the back of the wagon, and Samuel's eyes went to him with immediate practical concern. "The boy needs the house," Samuel said to Caleb. "Not a question. He's been sick, but he's on the mend. Mrs. Cole will have a room ready inside of 20 minutes. He was already moving. I'll send her word." And that was that, the machine of a well-run estate engaging without friction, and Elizabeth standing in the middle of it, realizing that this place had been running efficiently for years without her, and would have continued to do so. That she was not needed here for practical survival the way she had assumed. That the equation was different from what she'd built in her head on the long ride north. She didn't know yet if that was better or worse. Gunk. The inside of the house was worse than the outside, in the sense that it was more than she was prepared for. She had walked through the front door, expecting the interior of a rich man's home, cold, formal, all show, and no warmth. What she found instead was a house that had clearly been lived in by people who worked for a living. The floors were good wood, but scuffed from boot traffic. The furniture was solid and expensive in the way that functional things are expensive, not decorative ones. Books stacked on shelves that were also stacked with account ledgers and seed catalogs. A stone fireplace that was big because it needed to be big, not for effect. It was the house of a man who had money, but spent it on things that mattered. Mrs. Cole, Samuel's wife, a compact woman of about 55, with iron-gray hair and a look of absolute authority over her domestic domain, led Thomas upstairs to a room and had him fed and settled while Elizabeth was still standing in the front hallway, trying to reorganize her understanding of everything. Caleb came in behind her and stood at a distance that was respectful of the storm he knew was still sitting in her chest. "I can show you around," he said. "If you want." "In a minute." She turned to face him fully. "The people here. Samuel, Mrs. Cole, the workers in the yard. How many people work on this estate?" 22 full-time, Caleb said. "More during calving season. 22 people, a household, a community. And they all knew," she said. "When you left for Willow Creek, they all knew who you were and what you were doing." He met her eyes. "Yes." "Did they know why the disguise, the worn boots, all of it?" A pause. "Sam knew. He's known me since I was 12 years old. The others knew I'd gone looking. Not the details. But they called you boss just now?" Her voice was precise, not accusing precise, like a woman measuring a seam before she cuts it. "They knew you were coming back with a wife, and they were ready. Mrs. Cole had a room prepared. I sent word 2 days ago, from the last town." So he had known 2 days ago that she was coming, had been certain enough to send word ahead, had decided before she'd finished deciding that this was the outcome. She sat with that for a moment. "You were very sure of me," she said. "No." He said it with a directness that stopped her. "I was hopeful. There's a difference." She looked at him. "If you had said no at the fence post that morning," he said, "I would have walked away. I wouldn't have pushed. I wouldn't have tried to persuade you with all of this." He gestured at the house around them, a gesture that managed to be dismissive about a mansion which under different circumstances might have made her laugh. "I've had women change their mind when they saw this place. That's not something I wanted again." Elizabeth was very quiet. "Again," she said. He held her gaze. "Steady." Her name was Clara Donovan, 3 years ago. We met in Billings. I was honest with her, told her who I was, what I had, brought her out here." He paused. "She left 4 months later, said she couldn't stand the isolation, that the estate felt like a prison." Another pause, smaller. "That I felt like a prison." The house was very quiet around them. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, and meant it. "I learned something from it." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I learned that what I have here is not what everyone wants. And I learned that I didn't want to go through that again with someone who was in love with the idea of the estate instead of anything real." She understood then with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable what the worn coat and the cracked boots and the single gold coin on a counter had really been. Not deception, not manipulation, fear. The particular fear of a man who had been chosen for his wealth and left for his solitude, and had decided he would rather be chosen for nothing and found worthy than chosen for everything and found lacking. She still thought he had handled it wrong, but she understood it now in a way she hadn't at the top of the ridge. "I'm not Clara Donovan," she said. "No," he said. "You're not. And I'm not in love with your estate." "I know. But I am angry with you," she said. "That's still true, and it's going to take time before it isn't." He nodded. "That's fair?" "Then we understand each other," she said. "Now, show me the house." He showed her the house. It took an hour. Not because it was excessive, it wasn't. Not by the standard of what was here, but because Elizabeth asked questions about everything, and Caleb answered them all. Who had built the fireplace? Which season the east wing was added? What the small room off the kitchen had been used for before it became a storage room, and whether it could be used for something else now. That last question made him stop. "What would you use it for?" he asked. "A workspace," she said. "I sew. I need light and a table and a place where I can spread material without someone walking through it." He looked at the room. She watched him calculate windows' light direction proximity to the main house traffic. "We'd have to move about 12 years of poorly organized storage," he said. "I've organized worse things than storage." He looked at her then with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country as one. "I expect you have," he said. They went through the kitchen, large, functional smelling of the bread Mrs. Cole had apparently started the moment she'd heard the wagon. Through the dining room that was clearly rarely used for dining and frequently used for laying out plans, papers, and maps. Through Caleb's study, which he opened the door to and said simply, "This is mine, but you can use it whenever you need to." She noted that, filed it. At the end of the tour, they stood on the back porch, long covered, looking out over the valley in the last of the evening light. "Questions," Caleb said. "Several hundred," Elizabeth said. "I'll pace them." He almost smiled again. "All right." She looked out at the valley. At the building she now had names for the people, she now had faces for the whole complex living organism of this place that had been running quietly in these mountains while the rest of the world talked about him like he was a drifter. "The town," she said. "Willow Creek. When you were there, were you just passing through, or were you there specifically?" A pause that was just slightly too long. "Specifically," he said. She turned to look at him. "I'd been to 3 other towns," he said, "before Willow Creek, looking." He seemed to feel the inadequacy of that word as he said it. Not looking for a specific kind of woman. Just looking for someone real. Someone who had built something with their own hands and knew what it cost. "And in Willow Creek, you found a seamstress with a sick brother and an eviction notice," she said. "In Willow Creek, I found a woman who told Martha Pruitt to mind her own business without raising her voice or turning around," he said. "And then drove a harder bargain than any man I've done business with." She stared at him. He was completely serious. "Those were your conditions," he said. "Partnership, not transaction. Your brother covered. A voice." He paused. "You walked in with nothing and negotiated like you had everything. I wanted to know the woman who could do that." Elizabeth looked away, back at the valley. Her heart was doing something complicated that she wasn't ready to examine. "You're still in trouble with me," she said. "I know," he said. "That speech doesn't fix it." "I know that too." "Good." She straightened. "I'm going to check on Thomas and go to bed. We can start whatever this actually is in the morning." She went inside. Caleb stood on the porch in the dark for a long time after she left. Morning came early on the Whitmore estate. Elizabeth discovered this at 5 o'clock when the sounds of a working ranch horse's cattlemen calling across the yard, the ring of the smithy starting up came through her window with the absolute indifference of a place that does not adjust its schedule for new arrivals. She was dressed and downstairs before 5:30. Mrs. Cole was in the kitchen, and the look she gave Elizabeth when she walked in, not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet approval, told Elizabeth something about the previous women who had visited this house. None of them, she suspected, had been in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning. "Can I help?" Elizabeth said. Mrs. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then she handed her a bowl and pointed at the flour bin without a word. They worked together in the easy silence of two practical women who don't need to fill every moment with conversation. By 6 o'clock, Elizabeth had learned that Mrs. Cole had been on this estate for 18 years, that she had known Caleb since he was a young man, just taking over from his father, and that she expressed opinions about people through implication rather than statement, which was more effective anyway. "He's a good man," Mrs. Cole said once without looking up from the biscuits she was cutting. "I don't doubt it," Elizabeth said carefully. "Doesn't show it the right way sometimes." "No, he doesn't." Mrs. Cole glanced at her. "Clara Donovan wasn't suited." "He mentioned her." "He told you himself." The older woman seemed to take that as significant. "He doesn't usually say her name." Elizabeth said nothing. Let that sit. She wanted a city life, Mrs. Cole continued. Wanted him to sell the ranch and move east, build something different, when he wouldn't, when he couldn't really. This place is as much a part of him as his name. She decided he loved the land more than he loved her. She set down her cutter. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was too much to ask of her. But it wasn't nothing to ask of him either. Elizabeth thought about a man who had built himself down to worn boots and a single gold coin because he was afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons. "He should have been honest with me," she said. "Yes," Mrs. Cole said simply. "He should have, but he was afraid." "I know. Fear makes people do things sideways." She looked at Elizabeth directly. "Doesn't make it right, just makes it human." Elizabeth considered that for a long moment. Then she picked up the bowl again. They didn't talk about it anymore. They finished the breakfast. Caleb found her on the west pasture fence at 7 in the morning, watching two of his men work a young horse through its paces in the open field. He had clearly been awake since before dawn. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved when he came up beside her, alert already to a dozen things she hadn't learned to read yet. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." "I'm always up early." He leaned on the fence rail beside her, watching the horse work. "This bother you? The schedule? The whole thing? The noise, the people, He gestured vaguely. "The scale of it." She looked at the horse, a dark bay young, and a little uncertain, being patient with the trainer's patient work. "No," she said honestly. "It doesn't bother me. It's different from what I expected. But different isn't the same as bad." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people," he said, "when they come out here for the first time, they either fall in love with it immediately or they feel trapped by it. By the size, the distance from town, the mountains on three sides." "And Clara felt trapped," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. She met his gaze. "Mrs. Cole talks," she said. He exhaled. "Mrs. Cole has opinions. Good ones, mostly." She looked back at the horse. "For what it's worth, I don't feel trapped. I feel like I don't know what I'm looking at yet. That's different." She paused. "I've spent 7 years in a 2-room house in a town that didn't particularly want me there. This is bigger than that. But the mountain doesn't judge me. That's already an improvement." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, just enough. I want to learn the estate, she said. I want to understand how it runs, what the people here do, what they need, what matters to them. I'm not going to be decorative, Caleb. I told you that in Willow Creek, and I'm telling you again now. I know. And I meant what I said about a voice. When I have opinions about how things are done here, I want to hear them. She looked at him steadily. You say that now. I mean it now. He held her gaze. This place needs someone else who gives a damn about more than the cattle count. It's been missing that, for longer than I want to admit. Elizabeth thought about the way Mrs. Cole had said he doesn't usually say her name. Thought about the house that was full of function and short on anything that suggested someone had chosen comfort for its own sake. All right, she said. Then let's start with the account ledgers. He blinked. The account ledgers, she repeated. If I'm going to understand this place, I need to understand what it costs to run and where the money goes and whether the numbers make sense. Show me the books. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that reminded her strangely of the first time she'd told him she had conditions. You want to see the books, he said. Is that a problem? No, he said slowly. No one's ever asked to see the books before. Well, now someone is, Elizabeth said. Shall we? Mag. They spent 2 hours in the study with the account ledgers spread across the desk, and what Elizabeth found surprised her, not because the numbers were bad, but because they were good in ways that were unusual. The workers earned fair wages. Not generous by city standards, but fair meaningfully above what most ranches in Montana Territory paid their hands. The estate spent heavily on maintenance, on medical supplies, on food stores for the winter. There were regular payments to 3 neighboring families that were logged simply as agreements, without further explanation. What are these? Elizabeth pointed to the payments. Caleb looked at the entries. His expression shifted into something careful. Old commitments. My father made arrangements with some of the families when he was expanding the land. They let him buy land they'd been farming. In exchange, he promised quarterly payments as long as the estate ran. Are they still farming? Some of them. The Garrity family runs their own small spread on the east side. The Malone widow, her husband sold land to my father, and she's been on those payments for 12 years now. Elizabeth looked at the numbers, at the consistency of them year after year. You've honored these arrangements every quarter, she said. They were promised, he said, as if this was self-evident. She looked at him. Most men would have found legal grounds to end them when the land transferred. He said nothing. Your father made these promises, she said. Not you. You could have... They were promised, he said again. Simply. Finally. Elizabeth looked down at the ledger. At 12 years of quarterly payments to a widow who had sold her husband's land and received a promise in return. She thought about what kind of man honors the promises his dead father made to people who have no legal recourse. She thought about the worn coat and the cracked boots, and the way he had said, I have enough, more than enough. She thought about Thomas's room upstairs, where Mrs. Cole had put extra blankets on the bed, and placed a cup of willow bark tea on the nightstand, without being asked. She thought about the workers she had seen that morning going about their work with an ease that spoke of stability, of knowing their position was secure, of not having to worry that the man who employed them would change the terms without notice. She was still angry with him. That was true. But she was beginning to understand something about the shape of this man's character. Not the shape of his fortune, the shape of what he actually was. And those were 2 very different things. Thomas was better by the 3rd day. Not well, not yet, but measurably better, with color returning to his face and an appetite that had Mrs. Cole shaking her head in mock alarm at how much one skinny boy could consume. He moved carefully, conserved his energy, but his eyes were sharp again, and he watched everything about the estate with the focused attention of someone cataloging information they intend to use. On the 4th day, he found Samuel Cole in the barn. Elizabeth saw them from the yard, her 16-year-old brother standing beside the white-bearded foreman, both of them looking at a harness that needed repair. Thomas asking questions in that rapid-fire way of his, while Samuel answered in steady sentences without impatience, like a teacher who had found a student worth teaching. She watched them for a moment. Then Caleb came up beside her. "Your brother has opinions about harness design," he said. "Thomas has opinions about everything. Sam says he's right about the harness." A pause. "That's not nothing." Elizabeth smiled. Small private directed at the ground. "No, it's not." They stood there in the yard together, not close, not touching, the careful distance of two people who had agreed to something without yet knowing what exactly it would become, and watched Thomas hold forth about stress points in leather stitching, while Samuel nodded seriously. "He's going to be all right," Caleb said quietly. Not a question, a statement of something he had decided. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "He is." They stood there a moment longer. "Elizabeth." His voice was different, quieter. "I know I handled the beginning of this wrong. I know that's going to take time to—" "It will," she said. "I know." He was quiet. "I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of it. That I'm not expecting you to have moved past it." She looked at him sideways. "Good, because I haven't." "I know." "But," she said carefully, "I am beginning to understand it. What you did and why you did it. That's not the same as forgiving it, but it's a start." He held that with the same steadiness he held everything. "That's enough," he said. "For now." "Don't push it," she warned. "I'm not," he said, and almost smiled. The first real test came on the 6th day. It came from nowhere visible, which was the way the real tests always came. A man rode in from the South Road at mid-morning, wearing good clothes and an expression that Elizabeth, even from across the yard, identified immediately as the expression of a man who is very pleased with something he has not yet revealed. His name was Richard Holloway. She learned this from Samuel, who appeared beside her before the rider even dismounted, and said quietly in the voice of a man who has seen trouble before and knows how to greet it without flinching. "That's Richard Holloway. He's been sniffing around the south boundary for 2 months." "Who is he?" "He owns the 2 ranches east of the Garrity land. He wants the valley." Samuel's voice was flat. "He's been wanting it for 10 years. What stopped him?" "Caleb," Samuel said simply. Holloway dismounted in the yard, with the ease of a man who intends to make himself comfortable in a space that isn't his. He was perhaps 50, well-fed, with the kind of silver-templed handsomeness that is assembled carefully rather than arrived at naturally. He looked around the yard with proprietary interest that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. Then his eyes found her, and something changed in his expression. A recalculation. A new piece of information being slotted into whatever plan he was already running. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, crossing toward her. "I'd heard Caleb had finally gotten himself a wife. I didn't believe it." He extended his hand with a smile that showed teeth. "Richard Holloway. I'm an old friend of the estate." Elizabeth shook his hand. "Mr. Holloway. Is Caleb about?" "I'll let him know you're here," she said. She didn't go immediately. She let one moment pass, just enough to establish that she was not going to move at his timing, and then she went inside to find Caleb. She found him in the study. "Richard Holloway is in the yard," she said. The change in Caleb was immediate and complete. Whatever ease had been building in him over the past several days contracted into something alert and flat and very still. "What does he want?" he said. "He didn't say. He said he was an old friend of the estate." Caleb stood up. "He's not a friend of anything that isn't his." He moved toward the door, paused, looked at her. "Stay inside." Elizabeth looked at him. "Please," he added. "What is he?" she said. Caleb's jaw moved. "Trouble," he said. "The kind I've been expecting." He went out to the yard. Elizabeth went to the study window. She could see them clearly, Caleb crossing the yard, Holloway turning toward him with that assembled smile, the 2 men meeting in the center of the open space between the house and the barn like something choreographed. She couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she could read the posture. Caleb still collected his arms loose at his sides, Holloway expansive at ease, talking with his hands in the way of someone making an offer. Caleb's body language said no before Holloway had finished speaking. Holloway's smile didn't waver. He reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper. He held it out. Caleb looked at it but didn't take it. Then Caleb said something, and whatever it was, Holloway's smile did something small and complex, not disappearing exactly, but adjusting, tightening at the edges, becoming the smile of a man who has shifted from offering to threatening without letting the surface change. He put the paper back in his coat. He tipped his hat. He got back on his horse and rode south. Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment after he was gone, his back to the house looking at the south road. Then he came inside. He came directly to the study. Saw Elizabeth at the window. Did not tell her she shouldn't have been watching. "Well," she said. He sat down, stared at his desk for a moment. Then, "He's made a legal claim on the south pasture, 40 acres. Says there's a boundary dispute going back to my father's original land agreement." He was quiet. "He's been building this case for 2 years. I should have seen it coming sooner." "Can he win it?" Caleb looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "That's the problem." Elizabeth pulled up the chair across the desk and sat down. "Tell me everything," she said. He looked at her, at the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the fact that she had pulled up a chair instead of standing at a worried distance. "Elizabeth, Caleb." Her voice was quiet and precise and entirely serious. "You told me this was a partnership. We are 6 days into this marriage, and you have a legal problem sitting on your doorstep. Either it's a partnership or it isn't." She held his gaze. "Tell me everything." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he opened the desk drawer and started pulling out documents. And while the valley went about its business, outside the window, horses and the pasturemen at the fence line. Thomas, somewhere with Samuel, learning about harness stitching. Elizabeth Carter. Whitmore sat across from her husband and learned the shape of the storm they were going to have to face together. She had not come this far north across 2 days of mountain road into a hidden valley that had rewritten everything she thought she understood about her own life to turn away from a fight now. Whatever Richard Holloway had planned, whatever legal trap he had been setting for 2 years, he had made one error. He had ridden into this yard before he knew that Caleb Whitmore had someone sitting at his desk now who knew exactly what it meant to build something with your own hands and fight like hell to keep it. He didn't know Elizabeth Carter yet. He was going to. The documents Caleb pulled from that desk drawer told a story that made Elizabeth's jaw tighten. Not because they were complicated, because they weren't. The original land agreement, the one Caleb's father had filed when he first expanded the Whitmore holdings south toward the valley boundary, was straightforward. Clean language, clear boundaries properly witnessed. 40 years old and as solid as the stone walls of the house they were sitting in. But beside it, Caleb laid down a second document. A survey, dated 3 years ago, commissioned by Richard Holloway. Elizabeth picked it up, read it carefully, read it again. "This line," she said, pointing to the boundary marker on Holloway's survey. "It's 40 yards inside your father's original filing." "Yes?" "That's not a survey error. That's 40 acres of your best pasture land." "Yes." "And he's claiming the original boundary was filed incorrectly." She looked up. "Based on what?" Caleb's mouth was a flat line. "Based on a witness statement from a man named Gerald Pruitt, who was allegedly present when my father's surveyor did the original work 40 years ago." Elizabeth went very still. "Pruitt," she said. "Martha Pruitt's late husband," Caleb said. "He died 8 years ago. But before he died, apparently he gave a signed statement to a land agent in Billings saying that the Whitmore south boundary was measured incorrectly and that the true line was 40 yards north of where my father filed it." "A signed statement from a dead man," Elizabeth said. "A signed statement from a dead man that nobody saw until Richard Holloway produced it 2 months ago." Elizabeth set the document down with precise care, the kind of care that conceals a very controlled anger. "When did you first find out about this claim?" she said. "2 months ago, when Holloway sent his land agent to walk the south fence line." Caleb leaned back. "I sent him away. I should have taken it more seriously." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet, not evasive, just a man sitting with the truth of a mistake. "Because I was in Willow Creek," he said. "I'd been gone 3 weeks. Sam was handling things. And when I came back with you and Thomas, and I thought—" He stopped. "You thought it could wait," Elizabeth said. "I thought it could wait." She looked at him. Not with anger, with something more useful than anger. With the clear-eyed focus of a woman who has spent 7 years solving problems that couldn't wait and couldn't be wished away. "All right," she said. "Walk me through the legal structure. Who handles land disputes in this territory?" "The district court in Helena." "Has Holloway filed formally?" "Not yet. The paper he showed me today was a notice of intent. He's giving me 30 days to either negotiate a settlement or he files." "What does he want in the settlement?" Caleb looked at her steadily. "The south pasture, 40 acres, and water rights to the creek that runs through it." Elizabeth understood immediately. Without the creek, the north pasture became impossible to run in a dry summer. Without the south pasture, the herd would have to be reduced by a third. It wasn't 40 acres. It was the beginning of the end of everything this place was. "He knows exactly what he's doing," she said. "He's been planning it for 2 years. Longer than that." She tapped the survey document. "He had this survey done 3 years ago. He's been building this case since before you went to Willow Creek." Something moved across Caleb's face. A recognition of something he hadn't fully assembled before. "He knew I was going to leave to look for. He knew I'd be distracted." "Someone told him," Elizabeth said. "Someone who knew you well enough to know your habits." The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at the documents on the desk. At the survey, at the witness statement, at the neat, patient legal structure Holloway had assembled over 3 years, while the Whitmore estate went about its work unaware. "I need a lawyer," he said. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "But first, you need something else." "What?" "You need to find out if that statement is real." She met his eyes. "Gerald Pruitt is dead, but Martha Pruitt isn't." Martha Pruitt was the last person Elizabeth Carter had expected to matter once she left Willow Creek. But the next morning she sat across from Caleb at the breakfast table and said it plainly, "We need to go back." He looked up from his coffee. "To Willow Creek." Martha Pruitt was there when her husband signed whatever he signed, or she wasn't. Either way, she knows something. Elizabeth set down her cup. And Gerald Pruitt was a man who liked to talk. If he told his wife anything about what happened at that south boundary 40 years ago, Martha knows it. "Martha Pruitt doesn't like you," Caleb said carefully. "Martha Pruitt doesn't like anyone who doesn't need her approval," Elizabeth said. "That's a different problem." She paused. "She'll talk to you." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You want me to go without you?" "I want us to go together, but I'll stay in the wagon if that gets you further through her front door." She held his gaze. "I'm not proud. I'm practical. We use what works." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been married to me for 6 days, and you're already strategizing visits to my legal opponent's witnesses." "I've been practical my whole life," she said. "It's too late to stop now." He almost smiled. It was becoming, she realized, a reliable, almost something she had started watching for without quite deciding to. "All right," he said. "We leave tomorrow morning." They told Samuel before they left. Not everything enough. Samuel listened with his arms crossed, and his expression doing the careful work of a man who is not surprised but is deeply unhappy. "Holloway's been quiet for a reason," Samuel said. "He doesn't move until he's ready." "I know," Caleb said. "He's got someone on the inside, Caleb." Samuel said it flatly. Not an accusation, a statement. "Someone who's been watching this place. That survey was done while you were in Helena last spring. 3 days you were gone. Holloway's man walked the south line on day 2. Elizabeth watched Caleb's face process that. Who knew I was going to Helena? Caleb said. Half the outfit knew. Samuel's voice was steady. I'm not pointing fingers until I have something to point with, but I want you to know what I think. I know what you think, Caleb said. Keep your eyes open. Always do. Samuel looked at Elizabeth. You watch him out there. I intend to, Elizabeth said. Samuel held her gaze for a moment with those steady old eyes. Then he nodded. Not the automatic courtesy nod of a man acknowledging a woman. The nod of someone who has just decided something about someone's character. Good, he said simply. The road back to Willow Creek felt different in the other direction. Elizabeth noticed that immediately. Going north, she had been a woman moving toward an unknown. Coming south, she was something else, a woman who knew what she was defending, who had spread account ledgers across a desk and read land surveys with her jaw set and made decisions about witnesses before most people would have thought to ask the question. She was not the same woman who had ridden out of Willow Creek 6 days ago. She wasn't sure Willow Creek would notice. But she noticed. Caleb drove without rushing. The morning was cold, the road firm, and they made good time. Thomas had wanted to come, had argued for it in the direct, earnest way of a boy who has decided he belongs in the middle of whatever is happening. And Elizabeth had told him no, with such absolute finality that he hadn't pushed. He was well enough to be useful on the estate, and Samuel had projects for him, and that was that. He's going to be good at this, Caleb said about 20 minutes into the ride. Elizabeth didn't need to ask what he meant. He's good at everything he decides to care about. He reminds me of someone. She looked at him. My father, Caleb said. The way he asked questions, the way he listened to the answers, really listened like he was building something in his head while you talked. He was quiet for a moment. My father built this estate from 40 acres and a promise. He started with almost nothing. And Thomas started with less than that, Elizabeth said. I know. He kept his eyes on the road. That's what I mean. Elizabeth sat with that for a while, with the particular feeling of hearing someone speak of her brother that way, not with pity, not with charity, but with a kind of recognition that Thomas himself would have called the only thing he'd ever really wanted. She didn't say any of this out loud. Some things didn't need saying. Tell me about your father, she said instead. And Caleb talked, really talked in a way she hadn't heard from him yet for the next hour of road. About a man who had come to Montana with a horse and a hand tool and a will that was apparently geological in its stubbornness. Who had negotiated land purchases with handshakes and honored every one of them when the paperwork caught up. Who had built the estate piece by piece over 30 years, not with inherited money, but with compounded patience, with the kind of slow, certain work that doesn't make for exciting stories, but builds things that last. Who had died of a heart that simply wore out from working too hard too long with too little complaint in the winter of 1882. He never told people what he had, Caleb said. Not directly, he let the work speak. He said he used to say that a man who has to tell you he's worth something usually isn't. Elizabeth thought about a worn coat and cracked boots and a gold coin on a counter. You got that from him, she said. For better or worse? Both, she said honestly. For both. He glanced at her, and she let him see that she meant it without softening it, the criticism and the understanding in the same look, because that was the truth, and she wasn't in the habit of delivering anything else. He looked back at the road, but his shoulders did something, settled slightly, like a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has been told he can put it down just for a moment without it breaking. Willow Creek looked smaller than Elizabeth remembered. That was the first thing. The second was that it looked at her differently, or rather the people in it looked at her differently. She felt it the moment the wagon rolled down the main street. The eyes that came to windows. The woman who stopped in front of the dry goods store and stared openly. Old Mr. Hennessy, who came to the doorway of the mercantile and lifted a hand with something that looked almost like relief. The word had traveled, of course. In a town this size, word always traveled. The poor cowboy's wife had gone north and not come back starving. That was already more than most of them had predicted. Martha Pruitt's house was on the west side of town behind the church. Caleb tied the horse and looked at Elizabeth. "Together," he said. She had considered this for 2 days. "Together," she said. "Let her decide how she wants to handle it." They knocked. Martha opened the door, and her face did 3 things in rapid sequence: surprise, defensiveness, and then something that was harder to name. Something that looked briefly like the face of a woman who has been waiting for someone to come ask her a question that has been sitting in her chest for a very long time. "Elizabeth," she said. "Martha." A pause. "May we come in?" A hesitation. A longer one than was comfortable. Then Martha stepped back from the door. The inside of Martha Pruitt's house was exactly what Elizabeth expected. Precise, well-kept everything in its assigned place, the home of a woman whose control over her environment was her primary comfort. They sat in the front parlor. Martha did not offer tea. "I heard you were still up there," Martha said, "at his estate." She said the last 2 words with a specific emphasis, not quite mockery, but the kind of punctuation a person uses when they feel they were right about something and are deciding whether to say so. "We are," Elizabeth said. "And we've come because we need information about Gerald." Martha went very still. "My husband has been dead for 8 years, she said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "And I'm sorry for that. I mean it. Martha, Gerald was a good man, and I know you miss him." She held the older woman's gaze. "But before he died, he signed a statement about work he did as a witness 40 years ago. At the Whitmore South Boundary Survey." Something moved across Martha's face. Complicated and quick, and not entirely readable. "Who told you about that?" she said. "Richard Holloway showed Caleb the document," Elizabeth said. "He's using it to claim 40 acres of Whitmore land." Martha's mouth tightened. She looked at Caleb for the first time since they'd sat down. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Mrs. Pruitt," Caleb said. Quiet, direct, respectful. "Your father was a fair man," Martha said abruptly. Caleb blinked. "Yes, he was. Gerald respected him." She turned the words over like she was deciding which to keep. "He wouldn't have—" She stopped. Started again. "Gerald worked as a witness for land surveyors for 20 years. He knew what he saw and what he signed." "What did he tell you about the Whitmore survey?" Caleb asked. Martha looked at the window for a long moment. At nothing visible, at something internal, the specific weight of something she'd been carrying. "He told me," she said slowly, "that a man came to him about 6 months before he died. Came to the house. I thought he was a land agent. He said he was from Billings doing historical research on early Montana territory surveys. Said he was writing a record of the early boundary work." She paused. "He was very polite. Gerald liked him." Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. "Gerald talked to him for 2 hours, Martha continued. "Showed him his record books. He kept records of every survey he witnessed going back to when he started. Very precise man, Gerald. Everything written down." Her voice was doing something careful and controlled. "After the man left, Gerald said something to me. He said the man had asked him to sign a document confirming his recollections of a specific survey, the Whitmore South line. Gerald said he hadn't signed it." The room was very quiet. "He hadn't signed it," Caleb said. "He told me he hadn't signed it," Martha said. "He said the man asked him to confirm something that wasn't what he remembered, and Gerald wouldn't do that." She looked at Caleb directly. Gerald Pruitt was a precise man. He wouldn't sign his name to something that wasn't true. He told me that explicitly. He said, "Martha, that line was where old Whitmore put it, and I won't say otherwise." Elizabeth's heart was doing something fast and focused. "But there's a signed statement," she said carefully, "with Gerald's name on it." Martha's jaw set. "I know," she said. "Martha." Elizabeth's voice was quiet and very direct. "Did you ever see that statement? The one with Gerald's name?" A long pause. The longest one yet. "No," Martha said. But after Gerald died about a month after, that same man came back, said he just wanted to return Gerald's record books and pay his respects. She stopped. I let him in. I offered him coffee. He spent an hour going through Gerald's things with me, helping me sort them. She stopped speaking. Elizabeth and Caleb sat in the silence that followed and understood its shape exactly. His record books, Caleb said. Were they in order when you went through them later? Martha's eyes were very bright suddenly. The brightness of someone who has spent years being angry about something they couldn't name until this moment. One page was missing, she said. From the entry for the Whitmore South survey. I noticed it later. I thought Gerald must have removed it himself for some reason. He didn't remove it, Elizabeth said. No, Martha said. I don't think he did. The implication sat in the room between all three of them. A man who had come twice, once to press a dying man for a signature, once to take what he needed from a widow's house when she was too deep in grief to notice. The statement Richard Holloway has, Caleb said. Gerald's signature on it, it may be real. But what he was made to confirm, he wouldn't have confirmed it willingly, Martha said. Her voice had gone from careful to certain. Gerald's memory was as sharp at the end as it was at the beginning. He knew what he saw at that south line, he told me. She looked at Caleb with the clearest look Elizabeth had seen from her in years. Your father put that boundary exactly where the original agreement said it should be. Gerald saw it, and Gerald would not have signed his name to anything that said otherwise. Caleb leaned forward. Mrs. Pruitt, would you be willing to testify to that at a land hearing in Helena? Martha looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, who had sat across from this woman for 30 minutes and let her arrive at her own conclusions without pushing, without performing, without doing anything except being completely honest about what was at stake, held her gaze and waited. Gerald was a precise man, Martha said finally, and I am a precise woman. She straightened in her chair. I will not sit in this town and let Richard Holloway use my dead husband's name to steal land that was fairly bought and fairly bounded. A pause. Yes, I'll testify. They were back on the road within the hour. Elizabeth sat on the bench beside Caleb and felt the particular physical quality of having done something that mattered, a kind of tiredness that is also energy. The exhaustion of a person who has spent themselves on something real. She'll hold, Elizabeth said. She's made up her mind. Yes, Caleb agreed. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't push her? No. Most people in that room would have pushed. Pushing Martha Pruitt is like pushing a stone wall, Elizabeth said. You don't push her. You give her the information and get out of the way. He looked at her sideways. That careful assessing look that she was starting to be able to read, the look of a man who is genuinely surprised by someone and is deciding how to hold that surprise. You've known her your whole life, he said. I've watched her my whole life, Elizabeth said. That's different. Watching is more useful. He was quiet. The road ran north toward the mountains, toward the valley, toward the estate that was beginning, just at the edges, to feel like something she had a stake in. Not because of the land or the money or the stone walls of a mansion she hadn't asked for. Because of the account ledgers with the quarterly payments to widows. Because of Thomas learning harness repair from Samuel Cole. Because of a man who honored his father's promises and couldn't tell the difference between fear and honesty and had worn cracked boots into a mercantile with a gold coin and a question. She was not in love with Caleb Whitmore. She knew what love was, had felt it in its different forms for her mother, for Thomas, for the idea of a life that was more than survival. What she felt for Caleb was not that yet. It was something earlier than that. Something that was watching him and finding more than she expected, more than she'd been prepared for, more than she had a ready category for. Something that was beginning. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. When Holloway came into the yard, the way Samuel looked at him, the way you looked at him. She paused. There's history there. Not just the land claim, something else. Caleb was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. His father and my father were business partners, he said. A long time ago, before I was born. They built the first road through the South Pass together. Shared the cost, shared the contract. He paused. When the road was finished, the territorial government paid out. My father's portion was significant. Holloway's father claimed he hadn't received his full share. There was a dispute. It was settled legally in my father's favor. Richard Holloway grew up believing his family was cheated, Elizabeth said. Yes. And he's been building a case to take something back. That's what I believe. Was his father right about the payment? Caleb looked at her. A long, level look. I don't know, he said. I was not born yet. I have my father's records, and they show a clean settlement, but I wasn't there. He paused. My father was a fair man. I believe that completely. But fair men make mistakes too. Elizabeth sat with the honesty of that for a moment. A man who could say I don't know about his own father. Who could hold the possibility of imperfection without using it to collapse the whole structure of his belief? That complicates things, she said. Yes, he said. It does. Do you think Holloway knows that his case is built on a forged statement? I think he commissioned the forgery, Caleb said flatly. Or at the very least, he knew the man who acquired it wasn't a historical researcher. Then he's desperate, Elizabeth said. People who build their case on forged documents aren't confident. They're cornered. Or they're powerful enough to think it doesn't matter. He walked into your yard to show you a notice of intent, Elizabeth said. If he were that confident, he'd have filed already. He came to give you a chance to settle because he's not certain his case holds without pressure. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You're very good at this, he said. I'm very good at reading situations where someone has power over me, and I need to figure out how much of it is real, Elizabeth said. I've had a lot of practice. The mountains were coming back into view ahead of them, rising blue-gray against the sky, the valley hidden behind them as always, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. They arrived back at the estate in the last hour of daylight. Samuel was waiting at the gate. That alone told Elizabeth something was wrong. Samuel Cole did not wait at gates. Samuel Cole was always in the middle of doing something, and if he needed to talk to you, he found you wherever the work was. He came to the wagon before Caleb had fully pulled up. We have a problem, he said. Caleb set the brake. What kind? Holloway's man, the land agent who came through last spring. Peters, his name is. Samuel's voice was flat and deliberate. He's been on this estate, today, while you were gone. Elizabeth felt the cold move through her that has nothing to do with the weather. What did he do? Caleb said. Rode in claiming he had questions about a boundary marker on the east fence. Jake let him in. Jake didn't know he's been here 8 months. He doesn't know Peters's face. Samuel's jaw was tight. He was in the yard for 2 hours, talked to 3 of the hands, then he left. What did he talk to them about? Wages, Samuel said. Working conditions. Whether there'd been any changes since you got back. A pause. Whether there was a new woman running the household. Caleb went very still. He was building information, Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. He wasn't here about a boundary marker, she said. He was here to assess what's changed, what resources are in play, whether I'm a factor. She looked at Caleb. Holloway knows you have a lawyer now, or he suspects it. He sent Peters to find out how strong your position has gotten. She's right, Samuel said without hesitation. Caleb climbed down from the wagon, stood in the yard for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck, doing the thinking that he did better when he was doing something physical at the same time. He knows Martha Pruitt talked to us, he said. Or he suspects it, Elizabeth said. It doesn't matter which. He'll act as if she did. Which means he'll accelerate the timeline. Caleb looked at Samuel. He won't wait 30 days. No, Samuel said. I don't think he will. The 3 of them stood in the yard as the light faded around them, and the evening sounds of the estate rose up, horses settling the last of the work calls from the barn. somewhere inside the house. Mrs. Cole moving in the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening on land that someone very much wanted to take away. "We need to get to Helena," Caleb said, "before he files." "How long?" Elizabeth asked. 3 days' ride. Then we leave tomorrow morning. He looked at her. "You're coming." It was not a question this time. It was something else. Something that was also not an assumption, not an expectation. The statement of a man who has understood in the last 3 days what it means to have a partner. "I'm coming," Elizabeth said. "I'm the one who knows what Martha Pruitt said, and how she said it, and I'm the one who read those account ledgers, and I'm the one who—" She stopped herself, simplified. "Yes, I'm coming." Samuel made a sound that might, in a less dignified man, have been a laugh. "I'll have provisions ready by 5, he said, and went back to the barn. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed and Mrs. Cole had settled the house, Elizabeth sat in the study, alone with the documents spread around her. Not for the first time, but for the first time with a complete picture. The original agreement, the survey, the forged statement, the quarterly payments, the history between the Whitmore and Holloway families going back to a road contract before she was born. She was trying to find the thing she was missing, because there was always a thing you were missing. That was the first lesson of 7 years of survival on insufficient resources. You never saw everything at once, and the thing you didn't see was always the thing that mattered. She was still at the desk when she heard Caleb's footsteps in the hallway. He stopped at the study door, saw the light. He came in. He looked at the documents, at her, at the documents again. "You should sleep," he said. "In a while." She tapped the land agreement. "Your father's original filing. Who witnessed it?" Caleb came around to her side of the desk, looked at the signature line. "John Reardon," he said. "He was the Territorial Land Commissioner at the time." "Is he alive?" "He died in 1879. Who succeeded him?" Caleb looked at her with an expression that was sharp and alert and fully awake. "I don't know his successor personally, but the Territorial Land Office will have records. The original survey notes," Elizabeth said. "Not just the final filing. The actual field notes from the day the work was done. Those would have been submitted to the Land Office." "They should be in the archive in Helena," Caleb said slowly. "Then that's the first place we go when we get there." She looked up at him. "Before the lawyer, before anything. If the original field notes from 40 years ago show the same boundary line as your father's filing, then Holloway's survey and Gerald Pruitt's alleged statement are both worthless. They can't contradict a 40-year-old government record." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "If those notes exist," he said. "If they exist, Helena's archives are—" He paused. "Incomplete. Some of the early records were lost in a fire in 1875. Then we find out what survived." She held his gaze. "And we find it before Holloway does." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up a chair and sat beside her at the desk, not across beside. And without ceremony, he picked up the original land agreement and started reading it again from the beginning, with fresh eyes looking for what they'd missed. Elizabeth looked at him sitting there, this man who had disguised himself as poor and built himself a life out of patience and principle and stubborn inherited integrity, who was now in real danger of losing everything his father had built, because a man with a grudge and a forger's help had spent 3 years constructing a trap, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not pity, not the soft feeling she'd been careful to keep at a distance. Anger. Clean, purposeful, operational anger. This was not going to happen. Not to this estate, not to the workers whose wages appeared in those ledgers, not to the widow who received her quarterly payment without fail, not to Samuel Cole, who had been here 18 years and said boss, like it meant something. Not to Caleb Whitmore, who wore worn boots into a mercantile because he was afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons. Not while Elizabeth Carter was sitting at this desk. "Here," she said, pointing to a clause in the original agreement. "Read this line." He leaned in, and they worked. The lamp burned low. The house settled into its nighttime sounds around them. Outside the valley was dark and enormous, and theirs, and somewhere in the mountains to the south, Richard Holloway was already making his next move. He was moving fast, but so were they. They left before sunrise. Mrs. Cole had provisions packed, and waiting at the door, enough for 4 days organized with the efficiency of a woman who had been running a working household for 18 years and did not need to be told twice. She pressed a hand briefly to Elizabeth's arm as she passed and said nothing, and that said everything. Thomas was awake to see them off. He stood in the doorway in his coat still thin but standing straight with Samuel beside him like a wall that happened to have opinions. "I want a report when you get back," Thomas said. "You'll get one," Elizabeth said. He looked at Caleb with the level gaze that had been making grown men recalibrate since he was 12 years old. "Take care of her." "We'll take care of each other," Caleb said. The same words he'd used on the first morning outside Willow Creek. Thomas remembered Elizabeth could see it in his face, the small recognition, the decision that this answer still held up. He stepped back. Samuel put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, wordless, the gesture of a man who had watched this person grow from a boy into someone worth standing beside. And then they were moving the wagon, rolling out through the gate into the dark, and the estate fell behind them into the mountain morning. The road to Helena was 3 days in good conditions. Caleb pushed for 2.5. They didn't talk much on the first day. Not out of tension, out of the particular shared quiet of two people who have been working toward the same thing and don't need to fill the space between them. Elizabeth read through the documents again, the originals rolled carefully in her travel bag. Caleb drove and watched the road and thought in that internal way of his that she had learned to read as thinking rather than absence. On the afternoon of the first day, he said without preamble, "If the field notes are gone, if the fire took them, what's our position?" "Martha's testimony," Elizabeth said, "and the quarterly payments." "The payments don't speak to the boundary." "No, but they speak to character. They speak to the kind of man your father was and the kind of man you are, and that matters to a judge." She paused. "And Martha's testimony speaks directly to the forgery. If she testifies that Gerald explicitly told her he did not sign any statement about the Whitmore boundary, and Holloway produces a statement with Gerald's signature, that's not a land dispute anymore. That's fraud." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Fraud is harder to prove than a boundary dispute." "Yes. But it's also harder to sustain when you're standing in front of a judge and the widow of the man whose signature you forged is in the same room." He drove in silence for a while. "You've been thinking about this longer than one night," he said. "Since the moment you put those documents on the desk," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Why?" The question surprised her enough that she answered it honestly without the careful editing she usually applied. "Because it's wrong," she said. "What Holloway is doing. It's wrong in a way that has nothing to do with the land or the money, or even you specifically. He stole a dead man's name and used a widow's grief as cover and has been building a lie for 3 years. She looked at the road ahead. "I have very little patience for people who use other people's vulnerabilities as tools." Caleb said nothing, but something in him settled. She could feel it, the slight release of a tension she hadn't realized he was holding. Not relief that they had a strategy. Something quieter than that. Relief that she was angry for the right reasons. They made camp that first night on the south side of a long ridge, in a spot Caleb clearly knew from previous trips the logistics of it were too natural to be accidental. He had a small fire going while Elizabeth was still unpacking the provisions, and she didn't comment on the efficiency of it, just handed him his portion and sat down across the fire with her own. "Tell me about Helena," she said. "The land office specifically. Who runs it?" "Commissioner right now is a man named Arthur Graves. He's been in the position 4 years. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He's not a Holloway man as far as I know, but he's careful, political. He's not going to want a scandal in his office. Which means if we find evidence of forgery, he'll be motivated to resolve it quickly. Or to bury it quickly." Elizabeth looked at him. "You think he'd protect Holloway?" "I think Arthur Graves protects Arthur Graves," Caleb said. He'll do the right thing, if the right thing is also the safe thing. We need to make sure it is. How? Caleb looked at the fire. There's a newspaper in Helena, the Territorial Record. The editor man named James Whitfield, he and my father were old friends. He's been running that paper for 20 years, and he is not afraid of powerful men. A pause. If we find what I think we're going to find in those archives, Whitfield needs to know about it. Elizabeth understood immediately. Public record, she said. Make it impossible to bury. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. You've been thinking about this longer than one night, too, she said. He looked at her across the fire. And for the first time, not the almost smile, not the careful warmth he'd been rationing out since Willow Creek, he smiled fully. A real smile, unhurried, that changed his whole face into something she hadn't seen yet. Since the moment you pulled up that chair, he said. Helena hit them on the morning of the third day, like a cold splash of everything that wasn't the valley. After 2 weeks on the estate, Elizabeth had forgotten what a city felt like, the density of people, the noise and commerce, the particular energy of a place that does not stop moving when the sun goes down. She noticed Caleb's posture change as they came in off the North Road. Not uncomfortable exactly. Alert in a different way. The way of a man putting on a mode he doesn't use as his default. They went directly to the land office. The Territorial Land Office occupied the ground floor of a stone building on the main street, and it smelled like every government archive Elizabeth had ever imagined. Old paper ink, the particular dry mustiness of documents that have been filed and forgotten and outlasted the people who filed them. A young clerk with careful eyes and ink-stained fingers looked up when they came in. Caleb put his card on the counter. I need access to the survey archive. Original field notes from the 1847 boundary surveys in the Whitmore Valley District. The clerk looked at the card, looked up. That would be in the historical archive. Some of those records were damaged in the 1875 fire, Caleb said. I know. I need to know what survived. The clerk hesitated. Elizabeth put her hand on the counter. Not aggressively, just present. This is a matter of active legal dispute, she said with the precise, pleasant authority of a woman who has decided that confidence is a tool, and she is going to use it. We've come 3 days from the North Valley. We'd appreciate efficiency. The clerk looked at her, made a rapid assessment, decided. Give me 20 minutes, he said. The 20 minutes became 40, then an hour. They waited on a bench in the hallway while the clerk went into the back rooms of the archive. Caleb sat with his forearms on his knees. Elizabeth sat straight, her hands in her lap, watching the door. If it's gone, Caleb said quietly. It's not gone, she said. You don't know that. No. But I'm not going to sit here and plan for a version of events we can't do anything about. She looked at him. If it's gone, we find another way, but it's not gone yet. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and looked back at the door. The clerk came back at the 53-minute mark. He was carrying a flat document box, and he was moving carefully the way you move when you're carrying something old and significant. Survey notes from 1847, Whitmore Valley District, he said. They survived the fire. They were in the northern storage room, the one the fire didn't reach. He set the box on the counter with the particular reverence of a man who has just realized what he's handling. They haven't been accessed in let me see. He checked the access log on the outside of the box. 18 years. Caleb's hands were steady as he lifted the lid. Elizabeth leaned in beside him. The field notes were in the hand of a man who had written with precision and without flourish. A working surveyor's notes, not a document prepared for display. Measurements bearing marks, reference points. The kind of record that cannot be made to say something other than what it says because it was never trying to say anything at all. Just numbers. Just the land as it was on a specific day in 1847. Caleb found the south boundary entry. His finger went to the coordinate line. He read it again. Looked up at Elizabeth. She had already read it. The number was clear. The bearing was precise. The boundary line of the Whitmore South pasture was exactly where Edward Whitmore had filed it. Not 40 yards north, not a foot north. Exactly where it had always been. "It's here," Caleb said. His voice was level, but his jaw was tight with something that wasn't anger and wasn't relief, and was both of those things at once. "It's all here." Elizabeth turned to the clerk. "We need certified copies of these notes, today. All pages relating to the Whitmore Valley South boundary." The clerk was already reaching for his copy stamp. "Yes, ma'am." From the land office, they went to the lawyer. His name was Henry Cass, and Caleb had already sent word ahead, a message dispatched 3 days ago by the same courier service that had carried his word to the estate before they left Willow Creek. Cass was waiting for them in his office on the second floor above the bank, a thin man of about 60, with the kind of organized mind that expressed itself in a very clean desk. Caleb laid the certified field notes in front of him. Cass read them. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did. He sat back in his chair. "This is straightforward," he said. "Tell me," Caleb said. "Holloway's survey contradicts a 40-year-old government record. His witness statement, even if authentic, contradicts the same record. A judge is going to look at the 1847 field notes and look at Holloway's 1883 survey and ask a very simple question. Why should I trust a privately commissioned survey over a government record from the original filing?" Cass folded his hands. He has no good answer for that question. "He'll say the original survey was wrong," Elizabeth said. Cass looked at her with the attentive sharpness of a man recalibrating his understanding of the meeting. "Yes. And the opposing counsel, which will be me, will point out that if the original government survey was wrong, the error has gone unchallenged for 40 years, that no complaint was filed at the time, and that the only person who has ever claimed it was wrong is the man who stands to profit from that claim." "And Martha Pruitt," Elizabeth said. "She'll testify that her husband told her explicitly he did not sign any statement about the Whitmore South line." Cass was very still for a moment. "You have a witness willing to testify to the forgery?" "Yes." "Then this isn't just a boundary dispute," Cass said quietly. "This is fraud." "That's what I said," Elizabeth said. Caleb looked at her. She kept her eyes on Cass. "File an injunction," Caleb said. "Stop Holloway from filing his claim until this can be heard properly." "I'll have it drafted today," Cass said. He was already pulling paper toward him. "Holloway's going to fight this. He has money and he has connections in this district." "I know," Caleb said. "He's going to make it personal. He's going to go after your reputation. The story about you posing as—" Cass paused delicately. "About your time in Willow Creek. He'll use that to suggest deceptive character." The room was briefly very quiet. Elizabeth spoke before Caleb could. "Let him," she said. Both men looked at her. "Let him tell that story," she said. Caleb went to 3 towns looking for someone who would see him as a person rather than an estate. He found one. She married him, and she's sitting in this office. The jury isn't going to look at that story and see deception. She looked at Cass directly. They're going to see a man who values honesty enough to risk looking poor to find it. That's not a liability. That's character. Let Holloway try to turn it into one. Cass looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "were you a lawyer in a previous life?" "I was a seamstress," Elizabeth said. "We developed transferable skills." Cass almost smiled. It was clearly an infrequent event on his face, and he put it away quickly, but it had been there. "I'll have the injunction ready in 2 hours," he said. "Come back at 3 o'clock." They had 2 hours. Caleb used one of them to find James Whitfield at the Territorial Record. The newspaper office was 2 streets over, announced from half a block away by the sound and smell of a press in operation. Whitfield himself was in the back overseeing a print run, and when his assistant told him Caleb Whitmore was in the front office, he came out immediately, a large man of 65 with white hair and ink under his fingernails, and the look of someone who has spent 40 years separating important from unimportant and has gotten very fast at it. He took one look at Caleb and one look at Elizabeth and said, "You found her." "I did," Caleb said. Whitfield turned to Elizabeth. James Whitfield. I knew his father. You've got his stubbornness, I hope, he said to Caleb. She's got more than that, Caleb said. Whitfield sat them down, and Caleb laid out the situation in 15 minutes. The claim, the forgery, the field notes Martha Pruitt, the injunction being drafted 2 streets over. Whitfield listened without interrupting, which Elizabeth suspected was not his natural mode, and when Caleb finished, the older man sat back and was quiet for 10 seconds. Gerald Pruitt was a good man, he said. I knew him. The idea that Holloway used his name, he stopped himself. Reset. This needs to be public record before Holloway can manage the narrative. I'll run it in tomorrow's paper. Not speculation facts. The injunction, the field notes, the discrepancy between Holloway's survey and the 1847 record. He'll come after you, Caleb said. He's been trying to come after me for 15 years, Whitfield said. He hasn't found the angle yet. He looked at Elizabeth. You're willing to be quoted? Yes, Elizabeth said. What do you want to say? She thought for a moment. Then, that the Whitmore estate has honored every commitment it has made to its workers, to its neighbors, to the territorial record. And that Richard Holloway has built a legal claim on a document that a dead man's widow will swear her husband never signed. Print that. Whitfield wrote it down word for word. He looked up. Mrs. Whitmore, what did you do before you came to the valley? I kept my family alive, she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard exactly what he needed to hear. Good, he said. That'll be in the paper too. And the injunction was filed at 4 o'clock. They were on the road back north by 5. The ride out of Helena was different from the ride in. Elizabeth could feel the difference in her own body. Not relaxation exactly, because the fight was not over, but the release of the particular tension that comes before you act, the waiting tension. That was gone now. They had acted. The injunction existed. The field notes were certified, and in Cass's office, and in James Whitfield's desk, and in the copy Elizabeth had personally folded into her travel bag. Holloway was going to find out tonight or tomorrow morning, and he was going to be furious, and he was going to move. But he was going to move against something now, not on open ground. And that was a different fight entirely. Caleb drove without speaking for the first mile out of the city. Then he said, You told Whitfield to print that quote without asking me. Elizabeth looked at him. Yes. I'm not objecting, he said carefully. I just noticed. You were about to object to being quoted at all, she said. I could see it. You were going to tell him to keep your name out of the paper as much as possible. She met his gaze when he glanced at her. You can't afford to be invisible anymore, Caleb. Not in this fight. Holloway is going to control the story if you let him. You don't let him. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. I know. Another silence. Then quieter. I've been invisible for a long time. I know that too, she said. Not harshly, not with the edge of a woman making a point, just honestly the way she said most things. He held that. The road ran north between the dark shapes of the hills, and the stars were coming out in the gaps between the clouds, and the horses moved at a steady pace that would get them home in 2.5 days if the weather held. Elizabeth. His voice was different, quieter than his talking voice, the voice he used when he was not performing steadiness, but actually feeling it. I need to say something. All right. What you've done in the last 2 weeks. What you've done in the last 3 days specifically. Going back to Willow Creek reading the ledgers, Martha Pruitt, the land office Whitfield. He stopped, started again. I went to 3 towns looking for a real person. Someone who had built something with their own hands and knew what it cost. A pause. I didn't know what that would look like when I found it. I thought I was looking for patience, maybe. Steadiness. Someone who could manage, adapt. Elizabeth waited. I wasn't expecting this, he said. I wasn't expecting someone who would sit at my desk at midnight and find the thing I'd missed. Who would walk into Martha Pruitt's parlor and not push? He paused. Who would tell my lawyer to let Holloway tell the worst story about me because she'd figured out it wasn't actually the worst story? The night was very quiet around them. "Caleb," she said. "I know it's early," he said. "I know we're still building this. I know you're still angry, and that's fair, and I'm not asking you to—" "Caleb," she said it more firmly. He stopped. She looked at him in the dark. At the profile of a man who had built an estate behind mountains because he wanted to be seen correctly, who had worn cracked boots into a mercantile because he was afraid of being chosen for the wrong reasons, who had said, "We'll take care of each other," to her sick brother on the very first morning without hesitating. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. He turned to look at her. "I was angry because you didn't trust me," she said. "But I understand now why you didn't, not because it was right, but because you'd been given real reasons not to trust people who seemed trustworthy. That's not nothing." She paused. "And in the last 2 weeks, every time I've asked you something, you've told me the truth. The accounts your father, Clara, the Holloway history, all of it. You haven't managed me, or performed for me, or tried to make it easier than it is." "I haven't," he agreed quietly. "So, I'm not angry anymore," she said. "I'm something else." She looked back at the road. "I don't have a clean name for it yet, but it's not anger." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said, soft, careful, like he was handling something that deserved that kind of care. "Don't make it into more than I said," she warned. "I won't." "Good." They rode in silence for a while. The good kind. The kind between people who have said the true thing and don't need to add to it. After a while, Elizabeth said, "What's in the south pasture, the 40 acres specifically?" Caleb made a sound that was almost a laugh. The shift from something personal to something practical. The ease of it, the fact that she could do that, and he could follow. Best winter grazing on the estate, and the creek that feeds the north water supply. So without it, we'd lose a third of the herd capacity and spend 3 summers digging alternate irrigation. Holloway knew exactly what he was taking. "Yes." "Then we'd better make sure he doesn't get it," she said. "We're going to," Caleb said. And this time it was not a statement of hope. It was the statement of 2 people who have done the work and know the ground they're standing on. They arrived back at the estate on the morning of the 3rd day. Thomas was at the gate. He had been watching for them. Elizabeth could see it in the way he was positioned. The studied casualness of a boy trying to look like he hadn't been watching the road for 2 hours. He looked at their faces when the wagon pulled up. "Well," he said. "We filed an injunction," Elizabeth said. "We have the original field notes from 1847. Martha Pruitt will testify, and the story is going to be in the territorial record tomorrow morning." Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "So you won." "We've won the first part," Caleb said. "Holloway's going to fight it." "But you're ahead." "We're ahead," Elizabeth said. Thomas looked from one of them to the other. Whatever he saw in the space between them, in the way they sat on that bench, in the particular ease of 2 people who have been through something together and come out the other side, made him do something with his face that he tried to suppress and didn't entirely manage. He stepped back from the gate. "Samuel's going to want the full report," he said. "I'll go get him." He walked back toward the barn. But Elizabeth saw it, the thing he'd tried to hide. The quick private smile of a 16-year-old boy who had made a bet on the first morning on a handshake and the word each other, and was finding out now that he'd been right. Samuel met them at the barn door. He looked at Caleb, looked at Elizabeth, looked at the document bag in Elizabeth's hand. "Field notes," she said. "Certified." Samuel put both hands on the top of the fence rail and let out a long breath through his nose. "Lord," he said quietly. "We still have the hearing," Caleb said. "I know." Samuel straightened. "But you've got the ground under you now." He looked at Elizabeth directly. "Both of you." "Both of us," Caleb said. Samuel nodded, turned back to the barn. then stopped half-turned without looking at either of them. "Mrs. Cole's made breakfast. It's been warm for an hour waiting for you." A pause. "Don't let it get cold." He went inside. Elizabeth looked at Caleb. He looked at her. And something settled between them. Not dramatic, not announced. Just the quiet settling of two people who have stopped calculating the distance between themselves and started existing on the same ground. "Breakfast," she said. "Breakfast," he agreed. They walked inside. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Henry Cass sent word by courier on the 5th day after their return, a clean, precise letter that laid out the timeline the judge assigned, and one additional piece of information that made Caleb read the page twice before handing it to Elizabeth without comment. She read it. She read it again. "Richard Holloway has hired Thomas Webb," she said. "Yes. Thomas Webb is the most expensive land attorney in the territory." "Yes." She set the letter down on the desk. Outside the study window, the estate was going through its morning work. She could hear it, the sounds she had learned in the past weeks to read like a language. Horses at the trough, the ring of the smithy starting up. Samuel's voice calling across the yard low and carrying, the particular rhythm of a place that knew what it was doing. "He's scared," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Thomas Webb costs more than this land dispute is worth in legal fees," she said. "Nobody hires Webb unless they need to win badly enough to pay anything. Holloway's scared of what we found." She looked at Caleb directly. "He knows the field notes destroy his survey. He knows Martha Pruitt is going to testify. He hired Webb because he thinks enough money and enough pressure can bury a government record and intimidate a widow." "Can it?" Caleb said. "Not if we're in that room," Elizabeth said. She picked up her pen and wrote a letter to Martha Pruitt that afternoon. Not asking. Informing the hearing date, the details, what to expect, and one final paragraph that said simply, "You told me Gerald was a precise man. Let them see that precision in you. That's all we need." She sealed it and sent it with the next courier south. Then she went to find Thomas. She found him in the barn with Samuel, where he had apparently taken up more or less permanent residence in the 2 weeks since their return. He was healthier now, genuinely healthy color in his face, the cough-gone weight coming back on his frame in the way of a young person whose body remembers what it's supposed to do. Samuel had him learning the estate from the ground up, which was exactly what Thomas needed, and exactly what Samuel, though he would never say it in those words, seemed to need too. "I need to tell you something," Elizabeth said. Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending. Samuel kept his eyes on his own work with the studied neutrality of a man who knows when to be furniture. "The hearing is in 3 weeks, Elizabeth said. "It's going to be difficult. Holloway has hired the best lawyer in the territory, and he has money and connections and 3 years of preparation. We have the truth, one witness, and a 40-year-old government document." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously, the way she always considered Thomas's questions. "No," she said, "but I'm not going to pretend it's simple." Thomas looked at her with those eyes that had always been older than his age. "You're going to win," he said. "Not encouragement assessment. The statement of someone who has been watching carefully and reached a conclusion. What makes you say that?" "Because you've been right about everything so far." He looked back at the harness. "And because Caleb listens to you. People who listen to the right person at the right time usually end up on the right side of things." Elizabeth stood in the barn doorway for a moment. "When did you get so certain about people?" she said. Thomas shrugged, but she could see the corner of his mouth. "I watched you my whole life," he said. "I learned from a good source." She left before he could see her face do the thing it was doing. The 3 weeks moved fast and slow, simultaneously fast in terms of preparation, which was relentless, and slow in the way that time moves when you are waiting for something you cannot control to arrive. Cass came to the estate for 2 days in the 2nd week. He sat with Caleb and Elizabeth in the study, and they went through the case from every angle, not just the documents, but the story, the way it would be told in that courtroom, the places where Webb would attack, and what the truthful answer to every attack was. Webb was going to argue that the 1847 field notes were themselves inaccurate. Cass had anticipated this. They had a response. Webb was going to argue that Gerald Pruitt's statement was authentic and that Martha's testimony was the grief-clouded recollection of a woman misremembering a conversation from 8 years ago. They had a response to this too, the missing page from Gerald's record book, the second visit from the land agent, the timing that aligned perfectly with Holloway's known movements. Webb was going to argue, as Elizabeth had predicted, that Caleb's deliberate concealment of his identity and wealth in Willow Creek demonstrated a pattern of deception that made him an unreliable party. Cass had tried to prepare a careful, lawyerly response to this one. Elizabeth had looked at the prepared response and set it aside. "Let me answer that one," she said. Cass looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore testimony from a spouse carries, "I'm not going to testify," she said. "I'm going to be in that room. Let Webb make the argument. Let him look at me sitting next to Caleb and explain to a judge why a man who disguised himself to find someone who would choose him honestly is more deceptive than a man who used a dead man's signature to steal land." She held Cass's gaze. "That's not a legal argument. That's a human one, and judges are human." Cass was quiet for a moment. "She's right," Caleb said. "She frequently is," Cass said with the dry economy of a man who has revised his opinions about this case several times over the past 2 weeks and has stopped being surprised by it. "All right, we'll let that one breathe." The night before they left for Helena, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. Not from fear, she had established that clearly to herself in the first weeks on the estate. Fear was not the primary thing she felt about any of this. What she felt was the particular alertness of someone who has done everything they can do and is waiting for the moment when the doing becomes real. She got up, went downstairs, made tea. She was standing at the kitchen with her cup when she heard Caleb's footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway dressed clearly, also not having slept. They looked at each other. "Tea," she said. "Please," he said. They stood at the kitchen table, not sitting, just standing, and drank their tea in the quiet of a house that was sleeping around them, and outside the window, the valley was dark and enormous and absolutely still. "I keep thinking about what my father would say," Caleb said. "What do you think he'd say?" Caleb held his cup and thought about it honestly. He'd say that a man who builds something real doesn't need to fear a man who builds something false. That truth has a weight to it that forgeries don't. A pause. And then he'd probably say I should have filed a counter-survey the moment Holloway's man walked the south line. Elizabeth almost smiled. He'd be right about that last part. Yes. Caleb looked at his cup. He was right about most things. A pause. He would have liked you. Elizabeth looked at him. He had no patience for people who couldn't think under pressure, Caleb said. And he had tremendous respect for people who could. He would have seen you in that land office with the clerk the way you said we'd appreciate efficiency, and he would have come home and told Samuel that his son had finally done something right. The kitchen was very quiet. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it still. I love this estate," she said. He went still. "Not the way Clara didn't love it," she said. "Not the absence of that. I mean, I actually love it. The ledgers and the quarterly payments and the way Samuel said boss on the first day and the harness repair and Mrs. Cole's opinion on everything and the sound of this place in the morning." She set her cup down. "I love that it's yours, because you kept your father's word even when you didn't have to. I love that it runs the way it runs because the person at the top of it decided that was how it should run." Caleb was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful warmth, not the almost smile, not the steadiness he used as armor. Something open, something that had put down every layer of protection and was just looking at her. "I'm not done being honest," she said. "I love Thomas learning harness repair in that barn. I love that this valley is hidden behind those mountains. I love—" She stopped herself, met his eyes. I'm saying I love what this place is. I'm saying I understand now why you couldn't leave it for a city life. I'm saying Clara was wrong, not wrong to leave, wrong to think you loved the land more than you could love a person. He set his cup down. He crossed the kitchen to where she was standing. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. And what was in his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, completely without management, completely without the careful rationing of himself that she had watched him practice for weeks. I love you, he said. I know we're 5 weeks into this, and I know you're going to tell me it's too soon, and you might be right. But I've been watching you for 5 weeks, and I know what I see. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. It is too soon, she said. I know. I'm not there yet. I know that too. But, she said carefully, I'm closer than I was yesterday. And yesterday, I was closer than the day before. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. No, he said softly. That's not nothing. She picked up her cup. Go to sleep, Caleb. We have a hearing to win tomorrow. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he almost smiled, the full version, the one that changed his whole face. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. He went upstairs. Elizabeth stood in the kitchen alone for a while longer with her tea and the quiet of the valley and the specific clear feeling of a woman who has looked at the shape of her own life and found it for the first time in a very long time to be larger than she had expected. The courtroom in Helena was full. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected a procedural hearing, a small room, a judge, 2 sets of lawyers, a handful of witnesses. What she found instead was a room packed with people who had apparently decided that the Whitmore land case was worth seeing in person. Cass leaned over and said quietly, Whitfield's article ran 3 days ago, and the day before yesterday. He ran a second piece, about Gerald Pruitt's missing record page. Cass's voice was dry. He titled it, Dead Man's Name Used in Territorial Land Fraud. It was the most read piece in the territorial record in 2 years. Elizabeth looked across the room to where Richard Holloway sat with Thomas Webb. Holloway's face was composed, but it was the composition of a man who is working very hard at something. Webb beside him was the kind of lawyer who did not show anything under any circumstances, which made him harder to read. Martha Pruitt was sitting in the second row of the gallery. She had come alone. She had dressed carefully, the good black dress she'd worn to Gerald's funeral. Elizabeth guessed, which meant she understood the weight of what she was here to do. When Elizabeth caught her eye, Martha gave a small, precise nod. Not warmth. Resolve. That was better than warmth right now. Caleb sat beside Elizabeth at the respondents' table. He was very still. Not tense, she knew the difference now between his tension and his stillness. This was stillness. The posture of a man who has decided where he stands and is not going to move from it regardless of what happens next. She put her hand briefly on his arm. He looked at her. She took her hand away, but the look between them had done its work. The judge entered. The room stood. The proceedings began. Thomas Webb was very good. Elizabeth had expected this, but it was still something to witness in person, the precision of him, the way he built his argument, like a structure that anticipated every possible load and distributed it accordingly. He presented Holloway's survey with quiet authority. He introduced the witness statement with Gerald Pruitt's signature, with the careful gravity of a man handling evidence he knows is real. He spoke about the Whitmore boundary, not as a theft, but as a correction. A 40-year-old error finally being addressed, a record finally being set straight. He was persuasive, not because he was dishonest, but because he was skilled. And skilled, people can make persuasive arguments about things that aren't true. The judge, a man named Douglas Holt, 60 years old, with a face that had been listening to arguments for 30 years, and had learned to remain entirely neutral, while doing so, listened without expression. Then Cass stood up. He put the certified 1847 field notes on the judge's bench. He walked through them line by line. The measurements, the bearing marks, the precise, unambiguous coordinates of the Whitmore South boundary as recorded by a government surveyor 40 years ago. He did not editorialize. He did not attack. He simply read the numbers and let them speak. Then he called Martha Pruitt. Martha walked to the witness chair with the posture of a woman who has decided exactly who she is in this moment and intends to remain that person regardless of what is done to her. She sat down. She folded her hands. Thomas Webb stood for the cross-examination. He was respectful. He was careful. He was trying to dismantle the testimony of a widow without looking like he was dismantling the testimony of a widow, which was a very difficult thing to do, and he was very good at it. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "the conversation you're describing your husband telling you he had not signed any statement, this was 8 years ago. Is it possible you're misremembering the specifics?" "No," Martha said. "Memory is imperfect, Mrs. Pruitt, particularly over Gerald Pruitt," Martha said with great precision. "Told me on a Tuesday evening in October of 1879 that a man had visited him and asked him to sign a document stating that the Whitmore South boundary was 40 yards north of where it was filed. He told me the man's name was Peters. He told me he had refused because the statement was not true. And he told me that the Whitmore line was exactly where old Whitmore put it because Gerald had been there and seen it himself." She held Webb's gaze without blinking. "I am not misremembering, Mr. Webb. I am a precise woman. Gerald knew it, and I know it." Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his notes. Then he said, "No further questions." The gallery was very quiet. Cass stood up again. He introduced the evidence of the missing page from Gerald Pruitt's record book, the gap in the meticulous 40-year archive of a man who had never missed an entry corresponding exactly to the Whitmore South survey. He introduced the testimony of Samuel Cole, who had worked the Whitmore South pasture for 18 years and described its boundary with the specificity of a man who had ridden that line in every season. He introduced Caleb. Caleb testified quietly and without performance. The history of the estate, his father's original purchase, the quarterly payments to neighboring families, the 18 years of working the South pasture, as it had always been, worked without dispute or complaint from any adjacent landowner, until Richard Holloway had commissioned a private survey 3 years ago. Webb cross-examined. He moved eventually to Willow Creek. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "is it true that you deliberately concealed your identity and the extent of your wealth when you traveled to Willow Creek last spring?" "I did not tell people in Willow Creek the full extent of my resources," Caleb said. "That's correct." "You allowed people to believe you were a poor cowboy with no property." "I allowed people to form their own impressions based on my appearance," Caleb said. "I did not make false statements about my finances to anyone. Isn't that a form of deception?" Caleb looked at him steadily. "I was looking for a wife," he said. "I had previously found that when people knew the extent of my estate, the estate was what they responded to rather than me as a person. I chose to give people the opportunity to know me without that information in the way. I am not ashamed of that choice." "And your wife?" Webb said, turning to gesture at Elizabeth. "My wife?" Caleb said with a quiet, absolute calm that stopped the sentence before Webb could build it, went to Willow Creek and saw the records and heard Martha Pruitt's testimony and drove 3 days each way and sat in the Helena land office and found the 1847 field notes herself. She is the most clear-eyed person I have ever met. If she had found reason to doubt my character in the last 5 weeks, she would have said so. Directly. To my face. He didn't look at Elizabeth when he said it, but the room did. She held every gaze that came to her without flinching. Quiet. Present. Certain. Webb paused. Recalibrated. "No further questions," he said. Judge Holt took 1 hour. 1 hour in a side room with the documents and his own counsel, while the gallery waited with the particular compressed energy of a room full of people who have just watched something and are waiting to find out what it means. Holloway sat at his table and did not look at anyone. Webb sat beside him and made notes on a pad of paper, with the mechanical calm of a man performing composure rather than feeling it. Caleb sat beside Elizabeth and was still. She sat beside him and thought about nothing in particular. Not strategy, not outcomes, not the numbers in the account ledgers, or the coordinates in the field notes. Just the sound of the room, the weight of the moment, the clear specific knowledge that they had done every single thing that could be done, and now the doing was over, and what came next would come. "You're very calm," Caleb said quietly. "I've been calm in harder rooms than this," she said. He looked at her. "What's the hardest room you've ever been in?" She thought about it. "The doctor's office, when Thomas's fever crested," she said. "The night I wasn't sure he was going to make it." She paused. "Doc Harlan told me there was nothing more to be done medically, and that we just had to wait, and that some people his age came through and some didn't. And I sat in that office and made myself breathe and decided that whatever happened, I was going to be whatever Thomas needed me to be." She looked at her hands. "That was the hardest room." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "This isn't that," he said. "No," she agreed. "This isn't that." He reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. She let him. They sat like that quietly, without performance, without needing it to be more than what it was, until the door opened and Judge Holt came back. The ruling took 12 minutes to deliver. Judge Holt was a methodical man. He went through the evidence in the order it had been presented with the careful, unhurried precision of someone who has thought a thing through completely, and is now simply stating the conclusion. He discussed the 1847 field notes. He discussed the Holloway survey and the specific mathematical impossibility of reconciling it with the government record without accusing the original survey of error, an accusation, he noted, that had no supporting documentation whatsoever. He discussed the witness statement bearing Gerald Pruitt's name. He looked at Martha Pruitt when he said it. "The testimony of Mrs. Martha Pruitt," he said, "is consistent, specific, and credible. The court notes that Mrs. Pruitt's account of the circumstances surrounding her husband's alleged signature, including the visitor who identified himself as a historical researcher, the missing page from Mr. Pruitt's meticulous records, and the timing of a second visit immediately following Mr. Pruitt's death, raises serious questions about the authenticity of the document submitted by the plaintiff." Holloway's hands, Elizabeth noticed, went flat on the table. "Serious questions," Judge Holt continued, "that the plaintiff has provided no documentary evidence to resolve." He looked up from his papers. "The court finds in favor of the respondent, Caleb Whitmore, on all contested boundary claims. The Whitmore South pasture boundary is confirmed as established in the original 1847 territorial survey filing. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed." A pause. "Furthermore, the court is referring the matter of the Pruitt witness statement to the Territorial Attorney's Office for investigation into possible fraud." He set down his papers. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The room erupted. Not loudly, not the way rooms erupt in stories. More like the release of compressed air, a collective exhale, the sound of 40 people letting go of something they'd been holding. Martha Pruitt sat very straight in the second row and closed her eyes briefly, and Elizabeth saw her lips move in something that was either a prayer or a private word to Gerald. Caleb was very still for one moment. Then Elizabeth felt his hand tighten over hers. She turned to look at him. His face was doing something she had not seen before, not the almost smile, not the full smile, not the careful steadiness. Something more than all of those things. The face of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. "We won," he said. "We won," she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, like a man who had prepared himself for every other outcome and was now faced with the one he'd most needed and hadn't quite let himself believe in. Cass appeared at Caleb's shoulder, already reaching to shake his hand, already talking about next steps and the attorney's investigation and the timeline for Webb's likely appeal. Caleb stood to meet him. Elizabeth turned to find Martha Pruitt. Martha was making her way through the gallery, moving toward the door with the purposeful economy of a woman who has done what she came to do and intends to go home and have a cup of tea in peace. Elizabeth reached her at the door. "Martha." Martha stopped, turned. looked at Elizabeth with the steady, complicated gaze of a woman who contains multitudes and shows you about 3 of them at any given time. Gerald would have been satisfied, Martha said. He should be proud, Elizabeth said. He was, right up to the end. Martha looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her face, not softening exactly, because Martha Pruitt did not soften as a matter of policy, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized across the complicated history of 2 women who had spent years in the same small town without fully seeing each other, that they were more similar than different. "You've done well," Martha said. "Up there in that valley." "I'm learning," Elizabeth said. "You were always learning," Martha said. "You just didn't have the right ground to do it on before." She straightened her coat. "Come and see me when you're next in Willow Creek." "I will," Elizabeth said. Martha nodded once, went out the door. Elizabeth stood in the doorway for a moment and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been made right after being wrong for a long time. They were on the road north by mid-afternoon. Holloway had not spoken to them. He had walked out of the courtroom with Webb beside him, and his face had been the face of a man who has lost something he cannot afford to have lost, and is already calculating what comes next. Elizabeth had watched him go, and felt no triumph about it, only the clear factual recognition that this was not entirely over. The attorney's investigation would take months. Webb would likely file an appeal. Holloway was not a man who accepted defeat quietly, but the ground was theirs. The boundary was confirmed. The estate stood. Everything else was manageable. She said as much to Caleb as they cleared the city, and the mountains came back into view ahead of them. He listened. Then, "You're already thinking about the appeal." "Someone has to." He looked at her sideways. "Can you not do that for one day?" She looked at him. "Are you asking me to rest on something?" "I'm asking you to let today be what it is," he said. "Just today. The appeal can start tomorrow." Elizabeth considered this. "All right," she said. "One day." "Thank you." "Don't push it," she said. But there was no edge in it. He almost smiled. Then the full version. Then he looked back at the road, and she looked at the mountains ahead of them, and they rode in the good silence that had been building between them for 5 weeks, the silence of people who have earned each other. The road climbed north. The mountains grew. At some point in the second hour of riding, Elizabeth said, "I'm going to need a bigger sewing room." Caleb glanced at her. "I thought we cleared that storage room." "We did. But if I'm going to take in work from Helena, which I intend to do, I have contacts there now. I'll need more space and better light." "You're going to keep working," he said. Not a question. Trying to understand the shape of what she was saying. "I'm going to keep working," she confirmed. "This is your estate, Caleb. It'll be ours in time, I mean that. But I need my own thing too. My own contribution. Not management of the household and not decoration. Work." He was quiet for a moment. "The east room on the second floor," he said. 3 windows. Better light than anything downstairs." She looked at him. "It was my father's study," he said. "I've been using it for storage for 5 years because I couldn't decide what to do with it." He looked at her directly. "I think I know now." She sat with that for a moment, with the particular weight of being given the room that has been waiting unused because it needed a purpose. "All right," she said quietly. He nodded, looked back at the road. Neither of them said anything else about it. They didn't need to. They reached the estate on the morning of the 3rd day. The gate was open when they rode in, which meant Samuel had been watching the road, or more likely Thomas had been watching the road and had run to tell Samuel, and Samuel had gone to open the gate with the unhurried dignity of a man who was not going to run anywhere and was not going to pretend he had. Thomas was waiting in the yard. He looked at their faces. He had always been able to read her face. Thomas had been doing it since he was small, the particular attentiveness of a child who learned early that the face of the person responsible for your survival was worth paying close attention to. He read what was there. "You won," he said. "We won," Caleb said. Thomas looked from one of them to the other with that too sharp gaze of his. And then he did something he hadn't done since he was about 12 years old and had decided he was too old for it. He crossed the yard and put his arms around his sister and held on. Elizabeth held him back. Hard. With the specific wordless gratitude of a woman who has spent 7 years making sure this person survived to become the person he was becoming. Who had said yes to a stranger with worn boots and a gold coin because this person's life depended on it, and had found on the other side of that, yes, something she had not known to look for. She felt Caleb move away from them quietly toward Samuel, giving them the moment. That consideration, that reading of what a moment needed, was so characteristic of him that it made her chest do the complicated thing it had been doing more frequently over the past weeks. Thomas stepped back, looked at her. His eyes were bright, which he was ignoring with every tool available to a 16-year-old boy. "Samuel's been teaching me the south pasture fence line," he said, his voice perfectly steady. "All of it." "Good," she said. "You'll need to know it." He nodded once, squared his shoulders, went to find Samuel with the purposeful stride of someone who has things to learn and intends to learn them. Elizabeth stood in the yard alone for a moment. The estate moved around her with its familiar sounds. Horses, cattle, the smithy. The voices of people who had spent years building something here and were going to keep building it. The mountains on 3 sides holding the valley in the way they always had, unchanged by legal proceedings or land fraud or anything the territory had tried to put against them. Caleb came back to stand beside her. They looked at the valley together. "We should check the south fence," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "The ledgers need updating." "Tomorrow." She looked at him. "You told me one day." "We have until sundown," he said. "Let me have until sundown." She looked at the estate around them, at everything that was theirs, not hers, not his, but the particular kind of shared that is built slowly and means more for the slowness of its building. She thought about a worn coat and cracked boots and a gold coin spinning on a counter in a mercantile, in a town that had underestimated everyone it ever looked at. She thought about a woman who had said yes, not because she believed in him yet, but because she understood desperation and recognized in 15 minutes of conversation someone who was looking for the same honest thing she was. She thought about 5 weeks of ledgers and road dust and Martha Pruitt's parlor, and a lamp burning low in a study, and a kitchen at midnight, and a courtroom in Helena, and a hand over hers on a table, and a man who had laughed with surprise when the judge's gavel came down. She thought about the east room on the 2nd floor, with 3 windows waiting for a purpose. "All right," she said. "Until sundown." Caleb looked at her. The full smile. The one that changed everything. And Elizabeth Carter Whitmore stood in the yard of the Hidden Valley estate, with the Montana sky enormous above her, and understood with the clear and certain knowledge of a woman who has spent her whole life knowing exactly what things cost and exactly what they were worth, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because of the land, not because of the stone walls, or the barns, or the green impossible pastures, or any of the things that Richard Holloway had tried so hard to take. Because some people build their homes out of stone and timber and money and inherited acres, and some people build them out of something that cannot be surveyed or forged or stolen by any man with a lawyer and a plan. And what Caleb Whitmore had built in the end was not an estate. It was a life that was finally large enough for 2 people who had spent too long making themselves small. And Elizabeth had walked into it with nothing but her own clear eyes and her seamstress's hands, and the specific unbreakable knowledge of what it meant to build something real, and she had made it home.